I gripped the acceptance letter tighter as I stood in front of the house on Elm Street, trying to convince myself this was a normal job interview follow-up. The Victorian loomed 3 stories above me, all dark wood trim and elaborate gingerbread, details that must have cost a fortune to maintain. Heavy curtains blocked most of the windows from the inside, making the place look more like a museum than someone's home. The brass doorknob felt cold, even through my gloves when I knocked. Winter in Salem had a bite that cut straight through my jacket, and I shifted from foot to foot while waiting. $3,000 a month for housekeeping work. The number still didn't feel real. Emily Thompson, I presume. The woman who answered matched the voice from our phone conversation perfectly. Crisp, no nonsense. With just enough warmth to keep from being intimidating. Mrs. Catherine Eldridge looked to be in her 70s, but she stood straight and moved with purpose. Her gray hair was pulled back into a bun so neat it could have been painted on, and her eyes with a kind of sharp that missed absolutely nothing. Yes, am I single, quote Sam. Thank you for the opportunity. I held up the letter. I brought the paperwork you mentioned. Excellent. Come in, dear. No point in letting all the heat escape. The front hall hit me with the smell of old wood and something floral. Maybe potpourri, though I couldn't see any. The ceiling stretched up 2 stories with a staircase that curved along the wall like something from a movie. Every surface gleamed with polish, from the carved banister to the ornate mirror hanging near the coat closet. Impressive, isn't it? Mrs. Eldridge hung my jacket on an antique coat rack. The house was built in 1847. It's been in my family for generations. I nodded, taking in the details. Whoever had been cleaning this place before me knew what they were doing. Not a speck of dust anywhere, and the hardwood floors reflected the light from the chandelier above. Let me show you around before we the specifics of your employment. She led me through room after room, each one more elaborate than the last. The front parlor had furniture that looked like it belonged behind velvet ropes, all carved legs and rich fabrics. The dining room could have seated 12 people easily, with a table that stretched almost the entire length off the space. A library, lined with books from floor to ceiling, most of them looking old enough to be first editions. You'll be responsible for the main living areas, Mrs. Eldridge explained as we walked. The kitchen, parlors, dining room, library, and the front bedrooms. Upstairs, my private chambers are off limits, as is the 3rd floor. I maintain those areas myself. The kitchen turned out to be a blendo fold, and new original cabinets with modern appliances tucked inside them. Someone had put serious money into making sure the house stayed functional without ruining its historic character. The previous housekeeper left rather suddenly, Mrs. Eldridge continued, running her finger along a counter that already looked spotless. I hope you'll find the position more suitable to your temperament. Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully, but her expression gave nothing away. We climbed the main staircase to the 2nd floor, where she showed me the bedrooms I'd be cleaning. Each one was decorated in a different style, but maintained that same museum quality. At the end of the hall, she opened a door to reveal a small but comfortable room with a single bed, dresser, and writing desk. Your quarters, should you choose to stay overnight occasionally. Some employers find it convenient, especially during winter storms. The room was plain compared to the rest of the house, but it was clean and had its own small bathroom. I could see myself reading here in the evenings, assuming I took the job. Now, before we finalize anything, there are some specific requirements for this position. Mrs. Eldridge reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was precise, old-fashioned cursive, written in dark blue ink. 5 rules that must be followed without exception. They're not suggestions, Emily. They're requirements for your safety and continued employment. I unfolded the paper and read. 1. Never leave a room with the lights turned off. 2. If you hear a man crying, offer comfort. 3. If you see a woman in a yellow dress, don't let her see you. 4. If you hear a monkey, leave the house immediately. 5. Always check that the basement light is on before leaving. I read through the list twice, waiting for her to laugh or explain that this was some kind of test. When I looked up, Mrs. Eldridge was watching me with that same serious expression. I'm sorry, but a monkey. These rules exist for your protection. Emily, I won't elaborate on the reasoning, but I need your word that you'll follow them completely. No exceptions, no shortcuts, no assumptions about what might be harmless. The paper felt heavier in my hands than it should have. Each rule was stranger than the list, like something from a children's game rather than employment guidelines. But $3,000 a month was more money than I'd ever made. Enough to pay off my student loans and maybe even start saving for something better. Mrs. Eldridge, I have to ask, Are these related to security concerns, previous break-ins, or the rules are the rules, dear? Either you can follow them, or this position isn't for you. Her tone wasn't harsh, but it was final. No negotiation, no explanation, just acceptance or rejection. I folded the paper and slipped it into my purse. I understand. I can follow these. Excellent. The warmth returned to her voice immediately. Your salary will be $3,000 per month, paid on the 1st. I provide all cleaning supplies and equipment. You'll work Monday through Friday, 8 to 4, with an hour for lunch. Questions. When would you like me to start? Tomorrow, if you're available. I'll leave the supplies in the kitchen and a more detailed schedule of weekly tasks. She walked me back downstairs and retrieved my jacket from the coat rack. The whole interview had taken maybe 30 minutes, but I felt like I'd been there for hours. One more thing. Emily, Mrs. Eldridge's hand rested on the front door handle. The rules aren't eccentricities or family traditions. They're serious safety measures. Promise me you won't dismiss them as the quirks of an old woman. I promise. Good, I'll see you at 8 tomorrow morning. The cold air hit my face as I walked back to my car, but I barely noticed it. I sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, engine running, staring back at the house. Every window was dark, except for one on the second floor where I could see Mrs. Eldridge moving past the curtains. $3,000 to clean a house and follow 5 bizarre rules. The practical part of my brain, the part that had been budgeting ramen noodles for the past 6 months, said, take the money and keep my mouth shut. The rest of me was already wondering what kind of household needed rules about monkeys and women in yellow dresses. I pulled the list out of my purse and read it again. The handwriting was beautiful, precise, like something from a different era, but the content made no sense at all. Back in my apartment, I unpacked the few belongings I'd brought with me to Salem. A couple changes of clothes, some books, my laptop. I'd left most of my stuff in storage, not sure how long this job would last or where I'd end up next. I spread the rules out on my small kitchen table and stared at them while eating leftover Chinese takeout. Never leave lights off. Wasteful, but manageable. Comfort a crying man. Weird, but Maybesh had a neighbor with issues. Avoid a woman in yellow. Completely bizarre. Leave if you hear a monkey. What were the odds? Check basement lights. Probably some kind of electrical safety thing. None of it made sense, but none of it seemed impossible either. Just strange. I folded the paper back up and tucked it into my wallet. Whatever Mrs. Eldridge's reasons. $3,000 bought a lot of tolerance for eccentricity. I'd worked retail, food service, and temp office jobs that all had their own weird rules and demands. How different could this be? But as I got ready for bed, I found myself wondering about the previous housekeeper who'd left rather suddenly. What exactly had made her quit a job that paid so well? And why had Mrs. Eldridge been so insistent about the rules being safety measures? I set my alarm for 7 and tried to push the questions out of my mind. Tomorrow I'd start cleaning a beautiful historic house for more money than I'd ever made. Everything else was just details I'd figure out as I went. At least that's what I told myself. I had settled into a routine by my 3rd day at the Eldridge house. Catherine kept to herself most mornings, emerging only to check my progress, or offer brief instructions about particular pieces that needed extra care. The work itself was easier than I'd expected. Whoever had cleaned me had maintained everything so well that I was mostly just maintaining perfection rather than creating it. Celebre had become my favorite room to work in, floor to ceiling. Shelves lined 3 walls filled with books that looked like they'd been collected over generations. Some were clearly valuable first editions, their leather spines cracked with age, but still beautiful. Others were more recent editions, though even those seemed chosen to match Thuram's scholarly atmosphere. I'd been working my way through dusting each shelf methodically, taking my time to appreciate the collection. I was reaching up to clean the top shelf near the window when I heard it. A deep, mournful sobbing that seemed to echo through the walls themselves. The sound made me freeze with my dust cloth still raised above my head. My first thought was that Catherine might be watching something on television, though I hadn't seen a TV anywhere in the house. The crying was distinctly male, heavy with grief in a way that made my chest tighten just listening to it. I lowered my arm and stood still, trying to locate where the sound was coming from. It grew louder, more to this parade, and definitely seemed to be coming from somewhere near the main staircase. I set down my cloth and walked to the library doorway, peering out into the hallway. The sobbing continued, raw and heartbroken, echoing off the high ceilings. The second rule surfaced in my mind: if you hear a man crying off. I'd read that line probably 50 times since my interview, trying to make sense of it. Now, with actual crying filling the house, the rule felt less abstract and more immediately relevant. But comfort who? I couldn't see anyone, and Catherine was supposedly upstairs in her private rooms. This sound pulled at something in my chest, an automatic response to someone in pain. I found myself walking toward the staircase before I'd consciously decided to investigate. The crying grew. Cliff's eye moved, definitely coming from the second floor. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand trailing along the polished banister. The crying was louder here, more distinct, and I could tell it was coming from somewhere just ahead of me on the landing. My heart was beating harder now, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Something about the sound felt wrong. Too clear, to present for someone watching television or listening to a radio. When I reached the second floor landing, I stopped completely. Eamon was sitting on the steps leading to the third floor, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with each sob. He wore clothing I'd only seen in old photographs. A dark waistcoat, jacket, and some kind of formal cravat around his neck. His hair was disheveled, dark with streaks of gray, and he sat hunched over, like the weight of his grief was physically crushing him. But I could see through him, not completely. He wasn't invisible, but translucent, like looking at someone through frosted glass. The details of Fisk's clothing and posture were clear, but the wall behind him showed through his form just enough to make my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to turn around and walk away. This was impossible. People didn't just appear as see-through figures in hallways. But the crying was so real, so heartbroken, that I found myself taking a step closer instead of running. "Sir," my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "What's wrong?" The sobbing stopped immediately. The man raised his head and looked at me directly, and I had to grip the banister to keep from stumbling backward. His eyes were hollow, surrounded by dark circles, but they held such profound sadness that I felt tears prick at my own eyes. Just looking at him. "She's gone," he whispered, his voice carrying despite being barely audible. "My Margaret took her, I couldn't save her." The words hit me like this wasn't a neighbor with problems or someone Catherine knew. This was something else entirely. And I was having a conversation with it in broad daylight on a Tuesday morning. "I'm sorry," I managed, though my voice was shaking. "I'm so sorry for your loss." He looked at me for another moment, those hollow eyes searching my face like he was trying to remember something. Then Horror nodded once slowly, and simply faded. Not dramatically, not with any he just became less solid, until there was nothing left but empty steps and silence. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the spot where he'd been sitting. My hands were trembling slightly, and I could feel that weird lightheaded sensation that comes right before you either laugh or cry. From shock, the hallway was completely quiet now, as if the crying had never happened at all. Eventually, I made my way back downstairs and returned to the library. I picked up my dustcloth and tried to continue working, but my hands kept shaking just enough to make the task difficult. I kept glancing toward the doorway, half expecting to see him again, but the house remained silent. Catherine never mentioned hearing any crying, and I didn't bring it up. What would I even say? That I'd seen a translucent man in Victorian clothing, sobbing about his dead wife. That I'd followed the second rule, and it had actually applied to a real situation. The whole thing sounded insane, even to me, and I'd lived it. Booty couldn't shake the image of those hollow, grief-stricken eyes, or the way he'd thanked me with that single nod before disappearing. 2 days later, I was cleaning the drawing room when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A flash of bright yellow passed by the doorway, too quick for me to get a clear look. I glanced up from polishing the table, but the hallway appeared empty. I went back to my work, but a few minutes later, I saw it again. Definitely someone in yellow walking past the dining room entrance. This time, I got a better look. A woman in a dress that seemed to glow with its own light. The bright yellow in a way that suggested someone walking at a normal pace down the hall. The third rule immediately came to mind. If you see a woman in a yellow dress, do not let her see you. My heart started racing as I realized what was happening. This wasn't a neighbor or a Catherine wearing bright clothing. Based on what I'd experienced with the crying man, this was something else entirely. Anthe Rule had specifically warned me to stay hidden. I quickly crouched down and crawled under the dining room table, pulling my knees up to my chest and trying to control my breathing. The table was large enough to hide me completely with a thick tablecloth that hung nearly to the floor. From my position, I could see the doorway. Boots Willie couldn't be seen from the hallway. Soft footsteps approached, much lighter than the heavy boots I'd heard from the man on the stairs. They paused right outside the dining room doorway, and I pressed my hand over my mouth to muffle my breathing. The footsteps continued past, but something made me stay hidden. After a few minutes, The footsteps returned slower this time. They stood pedagging at the doorway, and I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched, like someone was standing there, looking directly at where I was hiding. My skin crawled with the feeling of eyes on me, and I squeezed my own eyes shut as if that would somehow make me more invisible. The silence stretched on until I thought I might scream from the tension. Then finally, the footsteps moved away again, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. I stayed under the table for another 10 minutes, just to be safe. When I finally crawled out, my legs were stiff from crouching, and my hands wet with sweat. The hallway was empty, but that feeling of being watched lingered for the rest of the day. Even when I was in rooms with no windows or doorways behind me, I kept glancing over my shoulder. That evening, I sat in Miss Mal's apartment and pulled out the list of rules. The paper looked exactly the same as it had 5 days ago, but now the words carried a weight they hadn't before. These weren't the eccentric requirements of a quirky old woman. They were legitimate safety measures for dealing with whatever was living in that house here alongside Catherine and me. I'd followed 2 of the rules and encountered exactly what they had warned me about: a crying man who needed comfort, a woman in yellow who shouldn't see me. Both had been real. Both had been impossible. And both had been handled according to Cawthorne's instructions. The practical part of my brain that had dismissed the rules as harmless oddities was no longer in charge. Whatever was happening in the Eldridge house, Catherine knew about it, had established procedures for dealing with it, and expected me to follow those procedures without question. I folded the paper and put it back in my wallet, but I'd already memorized every word. Tomorrow, I'd be more careful, more observant, and definitely more respectful of rules that were apparently the only thing standing between me and whatever those translucent figures actually were. The crying man had seemed sad but harmless. The woman in yellow had felt different, watchful, calculating, potentially dangerous. I was grateful I'd hidden when I did. $3,000 a month was starting to feel like hazard pay rather than generous compensation, but I'd successfully navigated to supernatural encounters and lived to tell about it. Maybe with right precautions and careful attention to Catherine's rules, I could handle whatever else the house had in store. I had been working at the house for 2 weeks when the incident with the monkey happened. The job had settled into a comfortable rhythm by then, and I'd grown to appreciate the quiet satisfaction of maintaining something sabotable and historically significant. That particular afternoon, I was in Catherine's study, organizing her extensive book collection, a task that had taken me the better part of 3 days to complete properly. The study was smaller than the library, but felt more with personal touches that suggested Catherine actually used this space for reading, and books were stacked everywhere, on the desk, in piles on the floor, wedged into already overstead shelves. Many were clearly valuably the bound volumes, with titles in languages I couldn't read, mixed with more modern academic texts on his genealogy. I'd been working systematically, creating separate stacks for books that belonged on specific shelves, according to what seemed to be Catherine's organizational system. I was reaching for a particularly heavy volume on New England folklore when I heard it, a distinct chattering sound that seemed to echo through the walls of the house. I paused, book in hand, listening carefully. The old Victorian made all sorts of noises throughout the day. Pipes creaked when the heating system kicked in. Floorboards settled with small groans, and the wind often whistled through gaps around the windows. This sound was different though, more rhythmic, almost like a conversation. I set the book down and continued sorting, assuming it was just another quirk of the old house. But the chattering grew louder, more distinct, and definitely not mechanical. The sound had a biological quality to it, an unmistakable pattern of communication that made the hair on my arm stand up. Then I heard it clearly, the unmistakable screech and chatter of a primate. Rule number 4 slammed into me consciousness like a physical blow. If you hear a monkey, leave the house immediately. Panic flooded through my system so fast it made me dizzy. My hands started shaking as the full implication. Fifth wasn't some random animal that had wandered onto the... This was exactly what Catherine had warned me about. Exactly what the rules were designed to handle. I dropped the books I was holding, not caring that they scattered across the floor with loud thuds. The chattering was getting closer, seeming to move through the house with purpose. I grabbed my keys from the desk where I'd left them and ran toward the front hall, my heart hammering against my ribs. My jacket was hanging on the coat rack near the front door, and I yanked it down while fumbling with the deadbolt. The chattering sound was louder now, definitely inside the house, echoing off the high ceilings in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to see whatever was making that noise. The door finally opened and I burst through it into the afternoon air. not bothering to close it behind me. I ran to my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine turned over on the second try, and I reversed out off his driveway faster than was probably safe. Gravel spraying behind my tires. It drove straight to the first motel I could find, a small place about 10 minutes away from the house. The desk clerk looked concerned when I walked in, still breathing hard and obviously shaken. But I managed to explain that I needed a room for the night due to a heating emergency at my place. It wasn't entirely a lie. There had definitely been an emergency, even if it wasn't related to heating. I spent that night laying awake in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had happened. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that I'd overreacted, that it could have been a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten into the house, but the sound had been too distinct, too clearly simian, and the rule had been too specific for coincidence. More unsettling was the realization that Catherine had known this could happen. She'd written that rule for a reason, based on some previous experience or knowledge that she'd chosen not to share with me. The urgency of the monkey rules suggested something different entirely. I drove back to the house the next morning, unsure what I'd find. Catherine was waiting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, and a knowing look that told me she was fully aware of what had happened the day before. "Good morning, Emily," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I trust you slept well." I sat down carefully, studying her expression. "Mrs. Eldridge, yesterday I heard. I know exactly what you heard, dear, and I'm very pleased that you followed the rules so promptly." She pushed the teacup toward me. "Sugar, you're not concerned about what I might have seen or heard. You're not going to ask me to explain why I left the house unlocked and ran away in the middle of my workday." Catherine's smile was gentle, but held depth. "I was only beginning to understand, Emily. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. The rule exists for your protection, and you followed it without hesitation. That shows excellent judgment." I wrapped my hands around Thuam's teacup, using the heat to steady myself. Books can be reorganized. You, however, cannot bear placed sois. Her matter-of-fact tone sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. Catherine wasn't just acknowledging that I'd encountered something dangerous. She was confirming that the danger had been real and immediate. From that day forward, I established a routine that Catherine had mentioned, but I had initially dismissed as unnecessary. Every evening before leaving, I checked the basement light. The basement itself was exactly what you'd expect from a house built in 1847. Stone walls, low ceiling, and the musty smell of old wood and accumulated ease. Old furniture sat covered in white sheets like ghosts themselves, and boxes of family memorabilia were stacked against the walls. But it was the single bare bulb hanging from a wire in the center of the ceiling that had become my gauge for safety. When the light was on, casting harsh shadows across the basement floor, I could leave the house without worry. When it was off, I learned to wait upstairs until it mysteriously flickered back to life on its own. The first time I found the off, I thought it was just a burned-out bulb. I went to flip the switch at the bottom of the basement stairs, but it was already in the up position. The bulb looked fine. No blackened glass or broken filament. I stood there for several minutes, unsure what to do, until the light suddenly came on by itself with a soft click. After that, I understood. This wasn't about electrical problems or maintenance issues. This was part of the same system that governed the crying man, the woman in yellow, and whatever had been chattering through the house that afternoon when I'd grabbed my keys and run. My skepticism had completely transformed into for the rules and a growing curiosity about the house's history. These weren't random supernatural encounters. They were part of something larger, more organized, with patterns and boundaries that Catherine understood far better than she'd initially let on. I still completed my daily tasks, still maintained the pristine condition of Fevery room, but now I worked with I listened more carefully to the sounds the house made, paid attention to movement in my peripheral vision, and never dismissed anything as coincidence or imagination. The rules weren't eccentric for navigating something that existed just beneath the surface of normal life. And every evening, I checked that basement light before heading home to my small apartment, where the only sounds were traffic and neighbors and other perfectly ordinary things that couldn't hurt me. The routine of checking the basement light each evening had become second nature by the time I decided I needed answers. 3 weeks of following Catherine's rules had shown me they were absolutely necessary, but understanding why required more than just blind obedience. The encounters with the crying man and the woman in yellow, followed by whatever had been making those primate sounds, had convinced me that the house held secrets worth investigating. My first day off that week, I drove to the Salem Public Library. The building was modern compared to the Victorian architecture I'd grown accustomed to, All clean line sand, large windows that let in natural light. After wandering the main floor a few minutes, I approached the reference desk where a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair was sorting through a stack of returned books. "Excuse me. I'm looking for historical information about a specific property in Salem. Would you be able to help me with that?" He looked up and adjusted his rectangular glasses. "Certainly. I'm Robert Mitchell, the head librarian here. Property records are one of our specialties. What address are you seeking?" "The house on Elm Street. The Victorian with all the gingerbread trim. I think it was built sometime in the 1800s. Robert's expression shifted slightly, becoming more interested. "Ah, the Eldridge House. That's quite a historic property. Are you doing genealogy research, or is this for our school project?" "Actually, I work there. I'm the housekeeper, and I've become curious about the history." He nodded and gestured for me to follow him toward a bank of computers. "We have extensive records on that house. It's been mentioned in several local history publications over the years. Let me pull up what we have." Robert's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, and within minutes, he had several documents displayed on the screen. Property deeds, tax records, and what appeared to be digitized newspaper clippings filled the monitor. "Here we go. The house was originally built in 1847 by Thomas Whitmore, a local merchant who made his fortune in the shipping industry. He commissioned it for his wife Margaret and their young daughter, Elizabeth. Quite an impressive home for that era." I leaned closer to read the property deed, noting the elaborate script and formal language. "What happened to the Whitmore family? Do you have records of when they sold the house?" Robert scrolled through several more documents before finding what he was looking for. "Actually, they never sold it. Thomas Whitmore lived there until his death in 1889. His wife Margaret died much earlier, though. Let me find that record." He pulled up a death certificate dated 1852. "Margaret Whitmore, age 40. Cause of death listed as consumption." I felt a chill run through me as I read that consumption was the old term for tuberculosis, and the date matched perfectly with what the crying man had told me about losing his Margaret. "Their daughter Elizabeth died young as well," Robert continued, clicking through to another record. "Scarlet fever outbreak in 1856. She was only 16. The death certificate for Elizabeth Whitmore showed she had died in June of 1856. There was no mention of what she'd been wearing, but the timing aligned with everything I'd experienced in the house. These weren't random they were the original family members still present in some form after more than a century in health. "That's terribly sad," I managed, though my voice sounded strained. "A whole family destroyed by disease. Unfortunately, common for that era." Robert agreed, "but there are other interesting incidents associated with the house throughout its history. Let me see if I can find the article about Therick's family." He opened a new search window and typed in several terms. After a moment, a newspaper article from 1923 appeared on the screen. The headline read, "Exotic Pet Kills Child Terror." My hands clenched in my lap as I read the article. The Hendricks family had been living in the Whitmore house during the 1920s. They had purchased an exotic pet monkey from a traveling circus, keeping it as an unusual companion for their 8-year-old son. According to the article, the animal had become aggressive without warning, attacking and killing the child before escaping into the neighborhood. The monkey had evaded capture for weeks, appearing in various locations throughout Salem and frightening reasons. Several people reported being chased or threatened by the animal. Eventually, a local hunter had tracked it down and killed it, but not before it had caused widespread panic throughout the area. "That explains a lot," I said quietly, more to myself. Then to Robert explains what. I realized I'd spoken aloud and tried to cover my slip. "Oh, just some of the local stories people have told me about the house. You know how old houses accumulate legends?" Robert nodded knowingly. "This house has certainly seen its share of tragedy. We've had several people research it over the years, mostly students doing projects on local history. The previous Shuka was particularly interested in the property records." My attention snapped back to him immediately. "Previous housekeeper Sarah Collins, lovely woman, worked for Mrs. Eldridge for quite a long time, 15 years if I remember correctly. She used to come in regularly to research various aspects of the house's history. Very thorough in her approach." "What happened to her?" "Mrs. Eldridge mentioned she left rather suddenly." Robert's expression became more cautious. "I'm not entirely sure. She stopped coming to the library about 3 months ago, and then I heard she'd left town. It was unexpected. She'd been sick, a regular patron, always, working on some historical research project or another." I felt my pulse quicken. Sarah Collins had worked at the house for 15 years, long enough to have encountered everything I'd experienced and probably more. If she'd been researching the house's history, she might have discovered information that Catherine hadn't shared with me. Do you happen to have any contact information for her? I'd love to talk to someone who worked there before me. Get some insight into the position. Robert hesitated for a moment. I can't give out personal information, but let me check if she left any emergency contact details. That might be appropriate to share. He turned to a different computer and typed in Sarah's name. After scrolling through several screens, he found what he was looking for. She did list a phone number as an emergency contact when she signed up for our research providers. It's from out of state though, Massachusetts area code, but not local. He wrote the number on a piece of scrap paper and handed it to me. He didn't get this from me, understand? But I think she'd appreciate hearing from someone who's taken over her old position. I took the paper gratefully. Thank you so much, and thank you for all the historical information. It's fascinating to learn about the house background. Robert smiled, but there was something thoughtful in his expression. Just be careful, Emily. Old houses have a way of keeping their secrets, and sometimes those secrets are better left. His words sent another chill through me, but I thanked him again and left the library with Sarah's phone number clutched in my hand. I sat in my car for several minutes before pulling out my phone and dialing the number. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, cautious and slightly tired. Hello, hi. Is this Sarah Collins? My name is Emily Thompson. I'm working at the Eldridge house now, and I was hoping I could talk to you about the position. There was a long pause before Sarah responded, and when she did, her voice sounded both relieved and concerned. Oh God, she hired someone else. Are you okay? Have you been following the rules? The urgency in her voice confirmed everything I had suspected. Sarah knew exactly what I was dealing with. Yes, I've been following them. That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. I've encountered some things that I think you might understand. Where are you calling from? Are you at the house right now? No, I'm at the library. It's my day off. Sarah was quiet for another moment. Listen, I can't talk about this over the phone. If you really want to know what you're dealing with, meet me tomorrow afternoon. There's a coffee shop called The Grind on Federal Street, near through Waterfront. 2 o'clock. I'll be there. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Emily, be very careful until then. And whatever you do, don't let Mrs. Eldridge know you're asking questions about the house's history. Some things are better discussed away from that place. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in the library parking lot with more questions than answers. Sarah's tone had carried a weight of experience and fear that made my recent encounters seem like minor inconveniences compared to whatever she'd covered during her 15 years at the house. I drove home and spent the rest of the day reading through the notes I'd taken at the library. The connection between the historical records and my supernatural encounters was Thomas Whitmore's grief over losing Margaret. Elizabeth's death in what was likely a yellow dress. The monkey that had killed a child and terrorized the neighborhood. Each rule in Catherine's list corresponded to a specific tragedy that had occurred in or around the house. But Cliff's sense remained. Why were these spirits still present after so many decades? What had happened to make Sarah leave so suddenly after 15 years? And why had Robert warned me that some secrets were better left undisturbed? The next afternoon I arrived at the Grind 15 minutes early and chose a table near the back where we could talk privately. The coffee shop was busy enough to provide cover for our conversation, but not so crowded that we'd be overheard. I ordered a coffee and settled in to wait, reviewing my mental list of questions. Sarah arrived exactly at 2 o'clock, and I recognized her immediately, despite never having seen her before. She had the look of someone who'd been sleeping poorly for months. Dark circles under her eyes, slightly hunched shoulders, and the nervous habit of checking over her shoulder, even when entering a familiar space. Her dark brown hair had premature streaks of gray, and she moved like someone who expected trouble around every corner. She ordered coffee at the counter, scanning the room carefully before approaching my table. When she sat down across from me, she immediately positioned herself so she could see both front door and the back exit. You must be Emily, she said, extending her hand. Thank you for calling. I've been hoping someone would take that job. But I've also been terrified of what might happen to them. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup, and I noticed she kept glancing toward the windows, as if expecting someone to appear outside. Her nervous energy was contagious, making me hyper-aware of every customer who walked through the door and every car that passed by on Federal Street. I'm going to be direct with you, Emily, because I wish someone had been direct with me when I started working there, she said, her voice low but urgent. What you are dealing with in that house isn't what Catherine told you it is. I leaned forward, keeping my own voice quiet. What do you mean? Sarah took a shaky sip of her coffee before continuing. Those spirits aren't just random hauntings or residual energy from past tragedies. They're trapped, they're deliberately. Catherine's family bound them to that property more than a century ago. The words hit me like cold water. I'd suspected the supernatural activity was more organized than random. But the idea that it was intentional changed everything. Bound them. How? Catherine's grandfather was an amateur occultist. His name was Edmund Eldridge, and he was obsessed with protecting his family's wealth and property. In 1895, he performed a binding ritual that tied the spirits of everyone who had died in that house to the building itself. Sarah's voice dropped even lower, forcing me to strain to hear her. He believed their presence would protect the property from intruders, thieves, anyone who might damage or devalue the. I felt sick to my stomach as the implications became clear. Thomas Whitmore's grief, Elizabeth's predatory watching, even the violent monkey that had terrorized the neighborhood. They weren't just tragic echoes of the past. They were prisoners held, against their will for over a century, to serve as supernatural security guards. The rules aren't just for your safety, Sarah continued, her eyes darting towards door again as a new customer entered. They're a containment system. Following them keeps the spirits from growing stronger, from becoming more dangerous than they already are. He thought about my encounters with Thomas and Elizabeth, how they had felt different from each other. Thomas seemed genuinely sad but harmless, while Elizabeth had radiated something darker, more threatening. What happens if the rules aren't followed? Sarah's face went pale. The spirits can feed off the energy of people who break the containment protocols. Each violation makes them more powerful, more able to affect the physical world. Eventually, they could become strong enough to leave the house entirely. The coffee in my mouth turned bitter as I imagined Elizabeth's calculating presence loose in the neighborhood. Or worse, the violent entity that manifested as monkey sounds, spreading beyond the Victorians' walls. How do you know all this? Did tell you? God, no. Catherine guards these secrets like her life depends on it, which maybe it does. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around herself. I found the information myself hidden in the basement. There's a grimoire down there tucked away, behind some old furniture. Catherine's grandfather documented everything. The original binding ritual, the properties of each spirit, the containment methods developed. My mind immediately jumped to the basement light. The final rule I check it every evening before leaving. The grimoire explains how it all works. Every detail, including how to potentially break the binding and free the spirits. Sarah's voice carried a mixture of hope and fear. But that's where it gets complicated. The book warns that releasing them without proper preparation could be catastrophic. Spirits who've been trapped for over a century might not react well to sudden freedom. They could become violent, seek revenge against anyone connected to their imprisonment. I processed this information while watching Sarah fidget with her coffee cup handle. She'd clearly spent months, maybe years, wrestling with the moral implications of what she'd discovered. You tried to convince Catherine to free them. I spent 2 years researching, cross-referencing his methods with other occult texts I found at libraries and used books to shroud New England. I thought I'd found a way to safely release them, to give them the peace they deserve after more than a century of captivity. Sarah's voice became bitter. Catherine wouldn't even look at my research. She insisted the binding was necessary, that, without the spirit's protection, the house would become a target for vandalism, break-ins, maybe even arson. I could almost hear Catherine's voice, making those arguments. Her practical concern for property values, outweighing any consideration for the trapped souls. She fired you for pushing the issue. The argument got heated. I told her she was perpetuating a crime against these poor people, that her family had turned tragedy into a perpetual tanta for the sake of protecting real estate. Sarah laughed bitterly. She told me I was being naive, that I had no understanding of the sacrifices required to preserve history. When I threatened to take my research to outside authorities, she gave me 2 hours to pack my things and leave. The timeline matched what Robert had told me at the library. Sarah's sudden departure 3 months ago hadn't been about finding a better job or relocating for family reasons. She'd been forced out for trying to do the right thing. Why did you leave town entirely? Why not just find another job? Sarah's expression darkened and she lowered her voice even further, because I was terrified the spirits might follow me. The grimoire mentioned that people who spend extended time in the house develop connections to the bound entities. After 15 years of daily exposure, I could feel them, even when I wasn't working. I'd hear Thomas crying in my apartment at night. I'd catch glimpses of yellow fabric in my peripheral vision when I was grocery shopping. A chill ran through me as I realized the implications for my own situation. I'd only been working there for 3 weeks, but I'd already had direct contact with both Thomas and Elizabeth. How long before I started experiencing what Sarah described? The longer you stay, the harder it becomes to leave, Sarah continued, her voice taking on Animo's pleading quality. It's not just the good pay or the work itself. Their spirits start to recognize you, to depend on your presence. Breaking away from that connection becomes more difficult, deeper. It grows. I stared into my coffee, watching the steam rise while processing everything she told me. The job I'd thought was just an eccentric elderly woman's preference for specific cleaning protocols was actually a participation in a supernatural prison system that had been operating for over a century. Emily, I'm begging you to quit before it's too late, Sarah said urgently. I know the money is good and Catherine can be persuasive when she wants to be, but this isn't worth sacrificing your freedom or your sanity. I looked up at her worn, frightened face and saw what my future could become if I stayed too long. Are you still affected by them, even living across the state? Sarah nodded miserably. The nightmares about the woman in yellow haven't stopped. Sometimes I wake up convinced he was standing at the foot of my bed just watching me with those horrible eyes. And Thomas. She paused, her voice breaking slightly. I can still hear him crying sometimes, usually late at night when everything else is quiet. It's fainter now, but it's still there. After 3 months, I'm still connected to them. I spent a restless night turning Sarah's words over in my mind, the weight of her revelations making sleep impossible. By the time my alarm went off at 7, I'd already been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and preparing for what needed to happen next. The drive to the house felt different now. I wasn't just going to work anymore. I was walking into a confrontation that would determine whether the first stayed or fled like Sarah had. Catherine's car was already in third way when I arrived, which wasn't unusual. She often came in early to handle correspondence or manage household affairs from her private office. What was unusual was finding her waiting in the kitchen, fully dressed and sitting at the small breakfast table with a cup of tea, cooling in front of her. Her posture was rigid, hands folded carefully in her lap, and her sharp gray eyes tracked my movements as I hung up my jacket. Good morning, Emily. How was your day off yesterday? The question sounded casual, but something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I set my purse down on the counter and turned to face her directly, my heart hammering against my ribs despite my determination to appear calm. I learned some interesting things of Booth House's history, about your family's involvement with the spirits that live here. Catherine's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. I'm not sure what you mean. The house is old. Certainly, and old houses accumulate stories over time. Most of them are nonsense. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, leaning forward slightly. I know about Edmund Eldridge. I know about the binding ritual he performed in 1895. I know the spirits aren't just random hauntings. Their prisoners have been keeping trapped here for over a century now. Catherine's Kate shifted, her shoulders pulled back defensively and her fingers curled into fists unthettable. Where did you hear such ridiculous claims? From Sarah Collins. You remember Sarah, don't you? The housekeeper you fired 3 months ago for asking too many questions. The mention of Sarah's name hit Catherine like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked every one of her 76 years. The careful composure she maintained cracked, revealing something vulnerable and frightened underneath. Sarah had no right to contact you. That woman filled her head with dangerous ideas that could have gotten people hurt. I pressed forward, sensing the opening. She told me about the grimoire, hidden in the basement. The one your grandfather used to document everything about the binding ritual and the containment methods. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, though she didn't actually drink from it. The silence stretched between us while she seemed to wrestle with how much to admit. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Yes, my grandfather performed the binding, but you don't understand the circumstances. The necessity of Waith did. The admission hung in the air between us like a confession. I felt a mixture of vindication and horror at having my suspicions confirmed so bluntly. Explain it to me, then. Help me understand how trapping grieving people and violent entities in this house for more than a century could possibly be necessary. Catherine stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to me as she stared out at the garden. Her reflection in the glass looked older, more fragile than the commanding presence. This house was built by Thomas Whitmore in 1847. By 1895, when my grandfather inherited it from a distant cousin, it had been abandoned for 6 years. Vandals had broken through windows, thieves had stolen everything of value, and the city was preparing to tear it down as a public nuisance. She turned back to face me, her expression filled with something Edmund couldn't bear to see such beautiful architecture destroyed. He'd studied enough occult practices to know that binding the spiritus who had died here would create a protective repression that would keep the properties safe from further damage. I tried to process the logic behind her grandfather's decision, but it still sounded like justification for an unconscionable act. So, he trapped Thomas Whitmore and his daughter Elizabeth to serve as supernatural security guards. Not just them. The child who died from the monkey attack, the animal itself, several other people who had passed away on the property over the years. Catherine Isvis became more animated, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as me. The binding gave their deaths meaning, purpose. Instead of simply being tragic losses, they became guardians of something beautiful and historically significant. The way she framed it, Madame's stomach turned. She was talking about enslaving the dead as if it was some kind of charitable act, giving their suffering a noble purpose rather than allowing them to rest in peace. What about their right to move on, to find whatever peace exists after death? Catherine's jaw tightened. Peace is a luxury not everyone can afford. This house has survived when dozens of other Victorian homes in Salem have been demolished or fallen into ruin. The Whitmore family's architectural legacy is intact because of the protection the spirits provide. I stared at her across the kitchen, seeing clearly for the first time how she'd rationalized generations of family participation in this supernatural print. In her mind, preserving historic architecture justified any amount of human suffering, even posthumous. Sarah said the spirits have grown more active recently. Is that true? Catherine nodded reluctantly. The binding weakens over time, requiring more careful maintenance of the containment protocols. That's why the rules have become so critical. Why? I needed someone who would follow them exactly without questioning their purpose. The revelation explained why she'd been so insistent about the rules during my interview. Why she'd refused to provide any context or explanation that might have led to the kind of questions Sarah had eventually asked. You've been looking for a housekeeper who would help maintain a supernatural prison, without knowing that's what they were doing. I've been looking for someone who could help me preserve something irreplaceable. Catherine's voice took on a pleading quality. Emily, you've seen how beautiful this house is, how much history it contains. You've also seen that following the rules keeps you safe while allowing you to work in an environment most people cowed to never access. She moved closer to the table, her eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I can double your salary, $6,000 a month. Plus, I'll teach you more advanced protection methods. Ways to strengthen the containment that will make your work even safer. The offer was staggering, more money than I'd ever imagined earning. Enough to pay off my student loans within a year and build your financial security. But the price was participating in keeping tortured souls trapped indefinitely for the sick. Preserving real estate. You're asking me to help you maintain a system that causes suffering to people who should have been allowed to rest in peace over a set. Catherine's expression hardened again. I'm offering you an opportunity to be part of something larger than yourself. To help maintain the delicate balance that keeps this neighborhood safe from entities that could become truly dangerous if they were The conversation had reached an impasse. Catherine genuinely believed she was doing something necessary and even noble, while I saw it as an ongoing moral catastrophe that needed to be ended. Neither of us was going to convince the other through argument alone. I need time to think about, I said finally. I need to walk around and process everything you've told me. Catherine nodded, though her relief was mixed with obvious anxiety. Of course. Take all the time you need. But, Emily, please remember that some decisions can't be undone easily. Some paths, once chosen, are difficult to leave. I left the house without responding to what felt like both a warning and a threat. The November air was sharp enough to cut through my confusion, and I found myself walking toward downtown Salem without any particular destination in mind. The tourist areas were quieter now that Halloween had passed, leaving me space to think without the usual crowds of visitors seeking supernatural experiences. The irony wasn't lost on AMA. Salem marketed itself as a place where people could encounter the paranormal while I was grappling with the reality of supernatural entities being held, against their will, just a few miles from the touristy witch museums and psychic reading shops. The commercialized version of the supernatural felt trivial compared to the genuine suffering I discovered at Eldridge House. I walked through the historic district, past houses that were a contemporary with the Whitmore property, wondering how many other families had made similar choices about preservation versus human decency. The streets were lined with beautifully maintained Victorian and Federal slums, each representing someone's decision to invest time, money, and effort into keeping the past alive. But none of them required supernatural imprisonment to maintain their historical integrity. By the time I'd circled back toward the waterfront, I'd reached a decision that surprised me with its clarity. The money waste tempting, and Catherine's arguments about preservation had some merit. But I couldn't participate in keeping Soul strapped indefinitely. However, simply quitting wouldn't solve the problem. It would just leave Catherine to find another, unsuspecting employee to help maintain the containment while the spirits remained prisoners. The only ethical path forward was to find a way to break binding while protecting both the neighborhood and the house itself from whatever chaos might result from suddenly releasing entities that had been trapped for over a century. It would be dangerous, complicated, and probably require months of careful research and planning. But it was the right thing to do. The sun was already starting to set. By the time I returned to Elm Street, Catherine's car was still in the driveway, and I could see light in the kitchen windows, suggesting she'd been waiting anxiously for my return. I took a deep breath before opening the front door, preparing myself for what would likely be another Catherine was sitting in exactly the same spot where I'd left her hours earlier, though she'd clearly been moving around during the day. There were papers scattered across the table and what looked like financial documents, mixed with older handwritten pages. Her eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting she'd been crying, or at least struggling with strong emotions while I was gone. "Emily," she said as I entered the kitchen, her voice with relief. "I was worried you might not come back." I hung up my jacket and sat down across from her again, noting that the handwritten pages appeared to be excerpts from the grimoire she'd mentioned. She'd been researching during my absence, probably trying to find arguments or information. "Convince me to stay." "I'm going to stay," I said without preamble, "but only under specific conditions." Catherine's face flooded with relief, though weariness remained in her eyes. "What conditions?" "We're going to research a way to properly release the spirits while finding alternative methods to protect the house. I want those souls to have the peace they deserve. But I also want to make sure that releasing them doesn't endanger you, me, or anyone else in your neighborhood." The relief in Catherine's expression shifted to alarm. "Emily, you didn't understand how dangerous that could be. These spirits have been contained for over a century. Releasing them suddenly could result in violence, revenge, chaos that spreads far beyond this property." I leaned forward, matching her intensity. "Then we do it carefully. We research every aspect of the binding, study methods for safe release. Maybe he'd even consult with occult practitioners who have experience with this kind of situation. But we do it with the goal of ending their imprisonment, not maintaining it indefinitely." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming nervously against the table. I could see her weighing the risks of agreeing to my terms again. Risks of losing me entirely and having to start over with someone who... "Sarah tried something similar," she said finally. "Her research was extensive, but ultimately flawed. She didn't fully understand the complexity of what my grandfather created." "Then we'll do better research. We'll take more time, be more thorough, and we'll have the advantage of your family's knowledge, combined with a fresh perspective that isn't invested in maintaining the status quo." Another long silence filled the kitchen while Catherine processed my proposal. I watched her internal struggle play out across her face, the fear of change, wearing with the recognition that I might represent her best chance of finding a solution that satisfied both practical and ethical concerns. "If I agree to this," she said, slowly, "you have to promise me that we won't take any action until we're absolutely certain it can be done safely. No impulsive decisions, no shortcuts that might put people at risk." I nodded, immediately agreed. "This is too important to rush or handle carelessly." Catherine stood up and walked to the basement door, retrieving a key from a pocket that I'd never seen before. "Then I suppose we should start by examining the source material. The grimoire is hidden behind some old furniture down there. If we're going to do this properly, you need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." I followed her down the basement stairs, my pulse quickening as we approached area. I'd been checking every evening for weeks without knowing its true significance. The bare bulb cast harsh shadows across the stone walls, illuminating and sheet-covered furniture that suddenly took on ominous possibilities. Catherine moved purposefully toward the back corner, shifting a heavy wooden chest to reveal a small alcove I'd never noticed Edinburgh. Inside, wrapped in dark cloth, was a leather-bound book that looked ancient even in the dim light. She lifted it, carefully, handling it like the dangerous artifact it clearly was. "This is Edmund Eldridge's grimoire," she said, turning back toward the stairs. "Everything you need to know about the binding, the spirits and etherics involved in changing the current situation, is documented in these pages." We climbed back to the kitchen where Catherine placed the book on the table between us like a treaty, waiting to like the leather cover was worn smooth from handling, and I could see that the pages inside were filled with dense handwriting in multiple inks, suggesting decades of additions and revisions. "Before we open it, Catherine said, her hand resting protectively on the book's cover. "He wants you to understand that reading this will change you. Once you know exactly how the binding works, how the spears are held, you'll never be able to approach this house the same way again. The knowledge becomes a responsibility you can't escape." I looked at the grimoire, then back at Catherine's lined face, seeing the weight of generations of familiar secrets in her expression. Sarah had warned me about developing connections to the spirits, about how difficult it became to leave once you were too deeply involved. But walking away now would mean abandoning both the trapped souls and Catherine herself to continue an increasingly unstable situation. "I understand the risks," I said, reaching for the book. "But doing a thing isn't really an option anymore." Catherine nodded slowly and lifted her hand from the cover. I opened the grimoire to the first page, where Edmund Eldridge's careful script laid out his intentions and methods for what he called the Great Binding of November 1895. As I began to read, I realized I was crossing a threshold that would define the rest of my time in this house, and possibly the rest of my life. Few words on the page were dense with technical terminology I didn't fully understand, but the basic structure of what he'd accomplished was clear enough. He'd used a combination of ritual magic, sympathetic connections to each spirit, and the house itself as a focus to create a supernatural prison that had operated for over a century. Breaking it would require understanding every component of his work and then carefully dismantling it piece by piece. Catherine pulled her chair closer to mine so she could see the pages as he read, and together we began the process of planning how to undo her grandfather's greatest and most terribly